Hello, this is Julian Hunt. Unfortunately, I could not present during the time of the presentation because my wife's grandmother died, and today, this morning, is her funeral. So I'm really sorry for that. So I decided to record instead this presentation. So in this presentation, I'm talking about land, water, wind, watershed cycle, a strategic use of water, land, and wind for climate change adaptation. It's a pleasure to be presenting this work at the third International Conference of Biofuel and Biomass. My name is Julian Hunt. I work at IIASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, in the Sustainable Service Energy Group. So this work was published in Climatic Change from um Springer, Springer Nature, and the motivation behind is that the way that we use water impacts the weather and the climate. There are hundreds of papers, thousands of papers showing that, for example, agriculture, irrigation has a significant impact on rain patterns and the temperature of the region. When you have irrigation, the humidity of the region increases, the temperature of the region increases, which also results in more rain. And and so the way that we use land, the way that we use water has a significant impact on the climate. Also, when we build hydropower reservoirs, we have also a change in landscape, which also impacts the climate. I have recently published a paper showing that in Brazil, the higher the level of the reservoirs, because we have some reservoirs, for example, that have 4,200 kilometers squared. So we talk about a huge reservoir. And when it's empty, this land mass reduces to 1,200. So reduces three times the area of the reservoir. It's a disaster, I know, but that's how it works. And the change in these reservoirs, they have a huge impact on the climate. And my recent paper shows that when the reservoir levels are high, there is almost 50 to 100% more precipitation, and the river level increases, doubles. That's in Brazil because Brazil is a country with very high humidity. You don't have so much evaporation because the atmosphere is already saturated, and the reservoir contributes to more rain. Also, for example, burning fossil fuels and using water steam to cool down, um, nuclear power plants, coal power plants also have increased the humidity in the region and precipitation in the region. The research question for this particular paper, this particular presentation is: can we manage land and water use to increase water availability of a region? So how can we, given that it impacts, how can we think in using land and water in the best way to increase water availability of a region? So then I created a methodology. One methodology looks at one particular basin, and in this particular basin, we want to see uh, where does the predominant winds blow, where it rains, what's the in this basin, what is the predominant humidity patterns, climate conditions. Then we look at downstream use of water. So within the basin, how is water used? Then we analyze how the impact of water use will have in the overall basin. So that's main steps. You could also consider having water being transferred between basins, and then you would need to know where this transfer happens, where this water and wind patterns happen. You need to know where where does the wind blows, so to which direction, in order to know where this humidity will end up, the evaporated humidity, and how this might impact the climate. What is the land required in order to consume all this water for the evapotranspiration, and then have an analysis of the impacts, the change in climate resulting from this. And then we apply this for Brazil. In Brazil, we have that in Brazil, in the northeast region, we have very, very strong trade winds, which happen 95% of the time. So if you see this wind direction graph, there is very, very little moments where when the winds blow on the from west to east. It's 95% of the time it blows from east to west. So there is very, very significant predominant winds in this region. This is the San Francisco basin, which we are analyzing. We're also analyzing the Amazon and the Tocantins basin. First, looking at the interbasin, so inside the basin. The San Francisco basin, in its end, like in this part, you have a significant drop in altitude. Here is around 400 meters altitude. When it reaches this section, it reduces from 400 to ocean level, zero altitude. So one proposal, for example, is to use most of the water that you have in the river for irrigation in the last section of the basin. Why? Because then you can use the water for hydropower, which we already have a lot of hydropower plants. And then when the head for hydropower head is not significant, you already use all the hydropower head, you use this water for irrigation, particularly in this region, which is not so large. It doesn't have enough area to be used, but if you could use it as much as possible with biomass plantation, with biofuels plantation of significant water consumption, and then this water evaporation, evapotranspiration water, you will evaporate, and the water will be carried back to Brazil. So any water that's used within this region goes back to Brazil. It doesn't get lost in the ocean. So you have a recycle of the water. So that's what I'm talking about. Watershed, water cycle, watershed cycle. You create an man-made water cycle. The evaporated water just goes back because of predominant winds in this region, and then you can significantly increase the water availability because the water that you would end up in the ocean goes back as humidity on land. And this particularly interesting to do this in the end of the basin. Why? Because the humidity will maintain as much as possible in the continent, and because you'll be able to use this water for hydropower and then for biomass plantation. Another example is to connect the Amazon basin, which is the river with the most water availability, through the Tocantins basin. Tocantins basin it has a lot of water availability, but it's some moments not so much. So, for example, in the dry season, it could be the case that you have water scarcity, but in the northeast of Brazil is the region with the least water availability. So the idea is u- to transport this huge water availability from the Amazon, from Tocantins Basin to San Francisco Basin and the other basins in the northeast. So the idea is to build the dams which are not built already. You have Tucuruí Dam, you have several other dams which are already existing. The idea is to upgrade these dams with pump storage. So the idea is to build these dams with reversible turbines so that you can either pump water up or generate electricity. So during the dry period, most of them will be only generating electricity. Will be pumping water from the Amazon. When you have excess water during the wet period, when it's raining a lot, you generate electricity with them. So the Tocantins River, this map is not showing, but the Tocantins River and the Amazon River, they meet, and they meet where the location, the water is still fresh. So the idea is to pump water from here. If you pump water from this location, you lower the water table after Tucuruí Dam in the Tocantins River. At this location, the depth of the river is minus 50, so you can reduce to -3, -2, -5, and that will extract water instantly from the Amazon basin. The Amazon basin water will flow to the Tucuruí Dam, and then you pump up this water again. You need to create a transposition channels in the last section of the Tucuruí basin, Tocantins basin, sorry, and then you will transfer to San Francisco basin. Transferring the water to the San Francisco basin, the idea is to irrigate, to 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 increase significantly the amount of biomass, irrigated biofuels in this region, and so the water you will be consumed, evapotranspirated. Most of this water extracted from the Amazon basin and using the Tocantins Basin as a channel with existing dams and new dams. And then the transposition channel, you can have two transposition channels. You have huge plantations, irrigated plantations. And what will happen is that you have huge amounts of evaporation. You can also plant in the northeast regions also because you already have transposition channels in this which are already built and operational. So you use all this land. You don't need to cut forest in the Amazon, for example, to build this. You can just take the water from its delta and bring it to San Francisco where we don't have water. Then you produce a lot of biomass. The biomass will evapotranspirate a lot of water, and then this water will go back to Brazil, to the Amazon. I mean, Brazil is already the country with like the highest water availability in the world. If you do this, what happens is that the water that would come out of the Amazon basin will be used for biomass irrigation. And what's happened is that this humidity that would leave the continent will maintain in the continent. It will actually go back inside the continent. So you increase significantly evapotranspiration of Brazil. This evapotranspiration will go, this humidity will go back to Brazil, increasing the water availability of Brazil. In Brazil, particularly, this can happen because you have this particular configuration of basins that the water flows in one direction and the wind flows in another direction. So the transposition takes water in this direction and the wind patterns blow in the other direction, which maintains the humidity in the country and increase the water availability. The positive aspects of this is that you have water water availability, you increase water availability in the San Francisco basin. You can use these dams for energy storage, pump storage, to manage the grid to allow more wind and solar entering, so to store renewable energies, increase significantly agriculture plantation in San Francisco Basin with the higher availability. You have flood controls in Araguaia Basin, which has significant issues with floods. You increase precipitation in the San Francisco Basin and the whole of South America. You have negative aspects is that it's very expensive to build these canals. You have significant environmental impacts because you need to build new dams, and you need to use the land, change the purpose of the land for agriculture, biomass plantations, and you have conflicts resulting from multiple uses of water. I guess this is not very relevant because you have infinite amount of water in the Amazon basin. And then if you look at other locations, so that's very particular for Brazil because Brazil is trade winds and you have winds go river goings in the opposite directions. But you could apply this differently. For example, in Europe, you have particular wind patterns which you can use. For example, these forehead winds, they blow in the Alps and then it rains. What you can do, you can take this water, pump back to this location, and then you use it, increase evapotranspiration here. The water will come back with the wind, will rain here again in the Alps, and then you pump it back, and then you create a similar system here, which you create a closed loop humidity cycle, which increases your water availability of the region. Another one is sea and land breeze around the whole world. You have this pattern when it's during the day, the water comes from humidity comes from the ocean. During the night, the humidity goes back to the ocean. Actually, dry, cold air goes to the ocean. But the idea is that to increase humidity in the land, what you can do, you can increase, you can have, for example, solutions that have high water consumption during the day. During the night, it stops, and then the water evaporation during the day will will blow back humidity to the coast. So, for example, maybe irrigated agriculture, you do it in the morning, and then in the evening, for example, you don't do irrigation, and then what happens is that all the water that you use for irrigation for agriculture and by the coast, this humidity will go back to the country and will increase water availability. Similarly, for mountains, for example, this is the opposite. You would use water during the night, so you would irrigate during the night close to a mountain because the humidity will go down to the surface. If you do it on the day, this humidity will be dissipated and go to different regions. So in conclusion, you have land, water, wind, watershed cycle is an approach to increase water availability of a region. It can be applied at different arrangements, as I showed. I showed 4 different arrangements, and it's a solution to mitigate and adapt to future changes in climate. I hope you like this presentation. Have a nice conference. I'm sorry not to be there at the time of the presentation, but it was a pleasure to share this research with you. Thank you. Bye bye.